Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, the Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading issue number 174. But before we get into that, just a little catch-up. We are currently at the last issue of the last story arc of Brian Azzarello's Hellblazer run. This story arc started with a burned body inside of an S&M club, and that body was supposed to have been John Constantine's. So we have a police investigation going on around that, and of course, the person heading that up is Agent Frank Turro, and he is trying to figure out how John died, because he is after a man named S.W. Manor, who supposedly was John's lover at this S&M club, and also the prime suspect, and Agent Turro has been trying to get S.W. Manor for a very long time, and this is his way in finally. And in the background, we're actually seeing S.W. talk to a priest, and he's been telling him kind of cryptic things about the past, about John, about like the way he's feeling right now, because he's all torn up, because he thinks he's being haunted by John's ghost, who he keeps seeing flashes of in the mirrors and stuff around his house. So the last issue actually ended with Agent Frank Turro finally getting the name of the man who did this to John, according to the witnesses in the club, and that was a man named Stanley, and Agent Turro knows that the S in SW stands for Stanley. So he's heading off to arrest S.W. Manor, and we left SW after he told his story about how John had said that he would give him what he wanted truly, and what SW really wanted was his murdered parents, and so John did a spell and brought them back in ghost form, but it turned out that his parents just kind of ridiculed him and told him that they were ashamed of the man he had become, and that they're disappointed in him, and John laughed the whole time SW's parents were telling him this, because he doesn't like SW. This was all kind of an act, so he could get back at SW, but then SW got revenge on him by setting up the events that led to John's body getting burned up. And that's kind of where we left it, with all that finally being revealed. And also there was a weird thing where a child was brought to SW's house, and it seemed like he was going to do something horrific to him in this issue. But first things first, with issue 174, we got the cover. We see a bunch of panels of all the different kind of curiosities and statues that are inside of S.W. Manor's house. It's kind of like a collage of all those pictures. And in between those pictures are pictures of people. We have SW's body. We have John Constantine's face. He's smoking, of course. A bunch of people in S&M bondage gear. And overlaid on top of that, we see S.W. Manor hanging by his wrists from some chains. And he doesn't have any clothes on, and he's staring out at us. And we can also see on the cover that this is written by Brian Azzarello with art by Marcelo Fruscian. And as we turn to the first page, we see Agent Frank Turro racing down the highway in his car towards what we can assume is S.W. Manor's house, and he has Detective Havlik in the passenger seat, and she's asking, "This is personal, isn't it?" And Turro answers, "Personal? Hell, I'm just doing my job same as you." But Detective Havlik isn't buying it, and she says, "So it is." And then Havlik gets serious, and he says, "Look, Havlik, what you read about him, it's bullshit. Among other things, he owns a media and publishing empire. Dolls him up as a humanitarian. Like fucking hell. He's scum. Trash. Filthy rich fits him like a rubber glove. He's behind this and the last recession. The president is afraid to say no to him, and not just ours. He's destroyed more lives than cancer, which is exactly what he is. His shitty fingerprints are on every bag of narcotics that comes over the border, and on the trigger of the Uzis used in last night's drive-by. S.W. Manor is a bastard who gets away with murder because he can afford to. And yeah, I take it personally." And Havlik replies, "Okay, Turro, but that's not who I meant by personal." And Turro's confused and he asks, "What?" And Havlik clarifies, "I was referring to the victim." And Turro smiles and says, "Oh, well, he's a bastard too." And underneath that last line, we get a shot of the immolated body that is sitting on a steel table in the morgue. That's supposed to be John. And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is Ashes and Dust in the City of Angels Conclusion. Then we turn the page and we cut to S.W. Manor's house, where he is talking to Father Sean, and they are indoors now, and they're standing in front of what looks like some sort of terrarium for vampire bats. So they're standing in front of a huge pane of glass. It's pitch black inside, but we can see a giant tree, or at least the shadow of it, and hanging on the limbs of that tree are a bunch of bats, and we can see their little beady red eyes as they stare back at SW and Father Sean. And SW is saying to Father Sean, "Once, Father, I wanted John Constantine to suffer. Then I wanted him completely. But he hurt me. So I wanted to destroy him. Absolutely. And absolute destruction. That's a special job. You can't just entrust something like that to any Tom, Dick, or Harry. No. You need a Richie, who held the liar responsible not only for the deaths of his brothers, but for the death of his best friend." And as SW says that last line, we get a panel of a bloody Dickie Furman on his hands and knees crying on the corpse of his dead dog. Now, this is all from the Good Intentions story arc. There was a giant pig that Dickie Furman was trying to go after, and John was with him, and John thought he was a bad guy. So John made the boar aware of Dickie's presence, and Dickie ended up getting gutted. And also the dog that Dickie had with him, which I guess was Richie's dog, got gutted as well. So in the next panel, we see Richie's face very angry, so we can assume that after John left, he blamed John for all of this, which is actually who he should blame because that's who caused it all. And over this panel, we get SW narrating, "A special man, a simple man. Use the liar's magic against him and send him packing to the hell he collected it from." Now, if you remember in the last issue, John had given SW a vial of dirt from hell. So that dirt is the magic that he's saying he got Dickie to use against John. And as he finishes saying that, Fredo interrupts saying, "Mr. Manor?" And as SW and Father Sean turn to Fredo, we see he's standing next to a little boy and a couple other of the guards. And as SW sees the boy, he smiles and says, "Fredo, and who do we have here?" And Father Sean says, "Tim?" So it seems he knows the boy. And then Timothy walks up to SW, and SW gets down on one knee and looks him in the eyes and says, "Timothy." And then from behind him, Father Sean, who looks very nervous now, says, "Stanley, what the hell is going on?" And SW turns behind him and says, "Heavens, Father, not in front of my young ward." And he turns back to little Timothy as he says young ward, and he sticks a finger under Timothy's chin, and then he gets a really creepy smile on his face, and his eyes get wide, like he's about to do something really evil to this kid. Then we turn the page, and we cut to the outside of the gates of SW Manor's house, and we see Agent Frank Turro and Havlik are standing outside their car and kind of leaning on the open doors, and they're just looking at it, and Turro says, "Where'd all this fog come from?" And Havlik answers, "Fog? It's the pollution settling." And Agent Turro says, "Really? That's funny." And Havlik says, "I don't get the joke." And Turro replies, "Come on, Havlik. We're outside on the estate of a billionaire industrialist." Then they both walk towards the front gates, and Havlik says, "Okay, reap what you sow, right? So, after we wrap this, you in town for a while?" And Turro answers, "You never know. Why you ask?" And Havlik answers, "I thought we might go out." And Turro asks, "Where you want to go?" And as they grab onto the wrought iron bars of the gate, she kind of looks over and smirks at him and says, "On a date." And then Turro smiles, but he doesn't look at her, and he says, "With me?" And then Havlik gets a big smile and says, "I'm a sucker for assholes." And then they turn around and rest their backs against the gate, and as they do, Turro says, "That sounds..." And Havlik cuts him off saying, "Hard to pass up?" And Turro says, "Well..." And Havlik cuts him off again saying, "You got a girlfriend?" And then Turro turns to her and smiles and says, "Not quite, but I probably should." So it seems like he's still kind of flirting with her. Maybe he's leaving it open for something to happen between them. But I do remember a couple arcs back when he and John were in the room with that prostitute, they did say he was married. But Havlik seems to be okay with the prospect of just having some fun with him. So she says, "Good. We'll see how it goes." And Turro asks, "When?" And Havlik answers, "After we're refused entry." Then they both turn around and look at the house again through the gate. And as Agent Turro is staring through the pollution mist in front of the house, he sees a ghostly figure in a trench coat light up a cigarette, and he says, "Jesus!" And Havlik asks, "What?" And of course, Agent Frank Turro thinks that was Constantine's ghost or something, or maybe the actual person. And it seems like he was pushing on the gates because as he's about to answer her, the ghostly figure disappears, but the gate begins to swing open, and he says, "It's open." So I guess they don't need a warrant or anything, or maybe they don't care, and they just walk through the gate. Now, there's about a football field of grass and mist pollution between this gate and the front doors, so they got a bit of walking before they reach the front door. Then we cut back inside S.W. Manor's house, where we see S.W. is still kneeling in front of Timothy, and they're in front of the bat enclosure. And S.W. is saying to Timothy, "You're an orphan, Timothy, aren't you? I'm an orphan too. And I know. It's no fun, is it?" And then he takes Timothy's hand and continues, "Not having any parents to hold your hand." And then he's cut off by Father Sean, who says, "S.W." And an annoyed S.W. Manor turns and says, "What?" And Father Sean says, "Is the meaning of this?" And then S.W. points at him and says, "The message is the meaning, Father. And if you'd shut your mouth, you'd get the message." And then he turns back and very sweetly looks at Tim and says, "Sorry about that, Timothy. Where were we? Oh, yes, holding hands. You know I've held your hand for a long time now. It's true. You may think your home is Father Sean's orphanage, but it's actually mine." And then he points at himself with his thumb and also gives a creepy big smile when he says mine. And we see Father Sean back away from this whole scene because I think he knows that something bad is going to happen to Timothy. And as he backs against the wall, we see this is the stairwell where all the animal heads are hanging. So he's right next to a tiger head. And of course, when I say head, I mean it's the stuffed and mounted like trophy head of a killed tiger. So to what SW said about the orphanage being his, Tommy says, Father, he tells us all the time how you give him money for us, all the computers." And SW asks, "Does he tell you why I give him the money?" And Timmy thinks and says, But SW cuts him off saying, "Don't say Timothy. It's not even a word. But I'll take that as a no, which is fine. Some people would have you believe they're saints. Some are more altruistic and are actually empathetic to the needs of others. Take your friends, the ones that come here and never come back. Does Father Sean tell you where they go?" And a very wide-eyed Timothy answers, "He says you find them families." And we get a panel of Father Sean looking very horrified as SW says, "Does he? Well, I've got news for you. He says that because he's a man of faith, and having faith means denying what you know is real, because reality is too hard to live with." And then SW Manor stands up and he pats Timothy's head and he says, "Now me, I know what's real. I know the pain an orphan really feels. And I have given you money for haircuts and underwear. But I'm about to give you something so much better. I'm going to take that pain away. You won't be an orphan anymore." And then he turns to the terrarium where all the bats are hanging, and he's looking inside, and Timothy does as well. And Timothy asks, "Are you adopting me?" And SW answers, "Timothy, have faith in me that if I did, the pain..." And then he pauses, and he thinks for a second, and then he says, "You see those bats? Do you know what kind they are? They're vampire bats, and they haven't eaten in nearly a week. You know what that's like, don't you? It's not good. So tell me, would you like to feed them?" And over that last line, we just see a wide-eyed Timothy pressing his face to the glass of the bat enclosure to look inside. So it seems SW is about to murder this kid by feeding him to vampire bats. And like I said before, Father Sean looks horrified at this. I think he kind of knew implicitly that the children were being killed, but he'd never seen it before. And this is just too much for him to take. So he grabs the tiger head off the wall, and he holds it over his head as he rushes towards SW, and he's yelling, "No!" And as SW turns and sees Father Sean running at him with his head, he also yells out, "No!" And instead of Father Sean hitting SW with the tiger head, either he misses or trips, or his whole plan was to do this, but he crashes through the glass with the tiger's head, falling face first into the enclosure. Then we turn the page, And we cut back to Agent Turro and Detective Havlick as they're approaching the front doors of S.W. Manor's house. And Turro is saying, "That lump of coal in the morgue ain't Constantine." And Detective Havlick says you? Every witness says different. And Turro asks, "Who do you believe?" And instead of answering that question, Detective Havlick asks, "Constantine, he was your snitch?" And Turro answers, "No, sort of. Look, despite all the evidence we had against Manor, his back pockets were bulging with senators, which means we had nothing. I couldn't touch him, so I got me an English middle finger that could." And then Havlick says, "Now he's dead. You feel guilty, and you still got nothing." But right as she says that, we see little Timothy burst through the doors with two of SW's security running after him with guns drawn. And they're doing this right in front of Detective Havlick and Agent Turro. And of course they see it, and Turro says, "Yeah? Call for backup." And he's reaching for his gun as he says this. Then we turn the page and we cut to the inside, where hundreds of bats are now escaping through the broken glass of the enclosure. And the first one to get attacked by them is Fredo, so he screams out as they attack him. Then we cut back to the enclosure where a very bloody and glass-ridden Father Sean is giving himself last rites, and he's saying, "In the name of the But he's cut off as SW reaches in and says, "Leaving already, Father? I don't think so. No, I don't. Not until I'm finished with my confession." But then as he grabs Father Sean, he turns because he hears 3 gunshots. And then he stands up, still dragging Father Sean by his coat, and he says, "Get up, you awful, dirty, ungrateful splash of shit!" And then he walks towards the sounds of gunfire. Then we cut back to the outside where Turro is taking care of business. He is shooting the men who had guns drawn on Timothy, and he's yelling, "Get the boy, Havlick!" And Timothy is running to her already, so she just grabs him, and she yells, "Turro, wait for the backup!" But Turro is on a mission. He just starts walking past the men he's just killed towards the front door, and she yells, "Turro!" But that still doesn't get his attention. And then we see Fredo burst out of the front door with bats surrounding him all over the place, and they're taking big bites out of him anywhere his skin is exposed. But he still has his gun drawn, pointing at Agent Turro. So Agent Turro takes aim, and as he shoots Fredo right in the head, Detective Havlick yells out, "Frank!" And I can't tell if this is a yell of concern about Turro being shot because Fredo came out pointing his gun at him, or if she's like surprised at the actions of Frank Turro because he's just going in guns blazing. Then we turn the page and we cut back inside to the room of curiosities inside of SW Manor, and SW has dragged Father Sean here, and a wounded Father Sean is sitting on the ground, his back leaning against one of these statues, and SW is grabbing a spear from the hands of one of the statues, and he says, "I'm not happy, Father. Not in the least." And Father Sean says, "I had no choice, Stanley." And SW turns and says, "Please, I'm not referring to what you just did, you sad, pathetic man. I'm talking about what I've done. The deep hole in my heart, which I dug myself." Then he points the spear tip right at the neck of Father Sean, and Father Sean asks, Tell me what you did, Stanley. For God's sake, just tell me." And then SW starts doing a bunch of moves with the spear, I guess showing off what he knows how to do. And as he does that, he begins his confession by saying, "No, but I will tell you for my sake. Earlier tonight, I went hunting, armed with a vicious animal, and with myself as bait." And as he's saying this, we're cutting to flashbacks of inside the S&M club, where we see him tied up. Now, just like before, in these flashbacks, he himself in the present is kind of here, and he's got the spear and he's doing his moves, as we're seeing the past version of him hanging from the ceiling ready to be whipped. Also, we see in the background some of the other characters that were witnesses before, so we can see the silhouette of the first witness, who I think was named Milton, and he is getting peed on by 3 men standing above him as he's laying on the ground. Then we see the silhouette of John walking up to SW just hanging there, and he says, "Hello, Stanley. How you hanging?" And then he grabs SW's chin, and SW says, "John, you shouldn't have crossed me." And John smiles and lets go of his face and says, "What do you mean? I gave you what you always wanted. It's not my fault, love. It weren't what you wished it to be." Then we see another silhouette behind John come out and say, "John Constantine." And as John turns around, we see that it is Richie Furman. So just in case you all aren't getting this, since it is all like time flashbacks and all this stuff, what's going on is this was earlier this night. SW has called Richie Furman here because he wants Richie to kill John so that he gets his revenge for the trick John played on him. And then also Richie will get his own revenge for John killing his brothers and his dog. So as John sees Richie, he says, "Richie, what are you doing here?" And then we can see he's got a vial in his hand, and it's the vial that John had given SW that was filled with dirt from hell. And according to John, there was a lot of magic in that dirt. So as he notices it in Richie's hand, he says, "And you better mind that load of hate you got a hold of. It's a powerful thing, it is. You have any idea what it can do?" And Richie replies, "I aim to find out." And John kind of smirks and says, "You sure?" But Richie doesn't answer, he just stares at John, and John taunts him, asking, "You really sure?" And we see Richie pull the cork out of the bottle, and then John says, "Well then, you will. Been carrying it round for a while, haven't you? You know how heavy it is, don't you? Like it weighs more than you." And as John is saying that, he pulls out his pack of cigarettes, and then as he puts one in his mouth, he says, "Like it's larger than you. And you feel it too. How it wants out. Desperately wants out. Let it out, Richie. It's all right." And then he hands Richie a cigarette, and then John lights his own. And as he does that, he says, "Let it out. It's what you want." And then Richie holds up the vial of dirt, and he pours it onto John's head. And as he does, we see behind them SW is yelling, "No!" So it seems like he's regretting his decision to have John killed. So now we kind of have what happened, I guess. And I say I guess because we don't actually see John catching fire here. We just see the dirt of hell being poured on his head, and we can assume, or it's implied, that hell's dirt made him burst into flames. And the reason we don't see that in the flashback is because it's SW telling the story, and he didn't see it because he says, I shut my eyes so tight, so very tight. It wasn't what I wanted. I couldn't watch John die, but I could smell him, the horrible stench of his burning. Where once there was a delightful aroma of stale beer breath and the sweet musk of his balls. And cigarettes. Always his cigarettes. And over those last couple of lines, we were getting some panels of Agent Turro walking into the house and then walking into this room of curiosities. And he has his gun drawn in front of him. And it seems like SW, even though he was telling the story, sees or maybe hears Frank Turro walk in, because he comes out from the shadows and swings his spear down, and the spearhead cuts off the gun hand of Agent Frank Turro, and then he spins the spear around and impales Agent Turro through the stomach, through his back, and then he pulls out the spear, and as SW brings the spear into like a ready position again, he asks, "Who are you?" And Turro just says, "Jesus fucking God," because we can assume his guts are kind of hanging out. And then SW walks over to the gun that has fallen out of the hand that he cut off. And as he picks it up, he mockingly says to Turro, who just said, "Jesus fucking God, really? Thought you wore a beard. Anyway, where was I? Oh yes, alone." And as Agent Turro slumps down onto one of the statues and then slides down onto the ground, he looks up and past SW, and then he says, Constantine. And this alarms SW, so he turns around and says, "What? You see him? Where? John?" And then he starts to look around all the statues, but he doesn't find anything, and he says, "John, why? Why'd you make me hate you when I loved you? My hate died in the flames, but my love..." And then he turns back quickly to Turro, and he says, "What's he doing?" And then Turro, I'm not sure if he's playing along or if he's actually seeing this, but he points behind SW and he says, He's crying, reaching out for you." And then SW turns in the direction that Turro was pointing, and he holds out his hand like he's trying to grab onto something, but there's nothing there. And he says, "Oh, John, I'm so sorry. So sorry. You gave me what I thought I wanted. I murdered you for it. And now, the king who has the world at his fingertips can't touch what he desires most." And this is all super dramatic, like he's saying lines from Shakespeare or something. And then he calms himself down and he walks over to Father Sean and kneels down. And we don't really see Father Sean's face. He might be dead too, we don't know. But SW says, "Father, can God forgive a man who can't forgive himself?" But the father doesn't answer, so we can assume either he's dead or passed out. So in his grief, SW takes the gun in his hand and he puts it under his chin and he pulls the trigger and he kills himself. And it's for sure because we do see the back of his head blow open. Then everything goes quiet and we see Agent Turro on his hands and knees and we can see his intestines are coming out of the wound and he just looks like he's in a lot of pain. Then we see some feet appear in front of him, and they are the feet of John Constantine, because as Turro looks up, he sees John looking down at him, and then John holds out his hand to Frank to help him up, and Agent Turro takes it, and John says, "Come on now, Frank, up with you." And I'm not sure if that John is like a ghost, or if it's actually John, because he looks different than he did in the rest of this storyline. He has like a mustache and a goatee, and we don't see his eyes. And the way the blacks are inked on his face, it looks like his cheeks are sunken in. So he looks like he's kind of like the angel of death or something. And since he said, "Come on, Frank, up with you," it could mean that the spirit of John is helping Agent Frank Turro's soul get to heaven. But unfortunately, we don't get an answer because as we turn to the last page of this story arc and this run, we see the lights on in this room of curiosities and there's a bunch of police in there. And we see the dead bodies of Father Sean and SW Manor. And we see Havlik is kneeling down next to something. And there's a detective that comes up to her with a bag of evidence and says, "The commissioner is on his way." "That it, detective?" But she doesn't say anything. So he says again, "Detective?" Then we see what she's kneeling by. And she's kneeling by the dead body of Agent Frank Turro. And she looks up from him towards the other officers in the room like she's looking around for something. And she asks, "Is someone smoking?" So I guess we're supposed to imply that maybe John actually was here and he's still alive. But we don't know because that's the end of the issue and the end of the Brian Azzarello run of Hellblazer. So next time we will be starting the Mike Carey run of Hellblazer, which I have heard very, very good things about. And also, this was the run that was going on when the Constantine movie came out in the 2000s. So that movie pulled from the attitude and sensibilities of the Mike Carey run of Hellblazer. So we'll be getting into that in the next episode. So until then, if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.